Hello, welcome to the Journal Perpetual Access Tracking, an open source news system. I'm Melissa Belvati. I am the Acquisition Serials and Electronic Resources Librarian at the University of Prince Edward Island in Canada. So the agenda for this presentation is first to give you some background on an organization called CRKN and the Perpetual Access Rights Reports project that comes from the CRKN group, and then finally show you a web-based tool written at UPEI to be able to search spreadsheets that are part of that Perpetual Access Rights project. For the purpose of this presentation, Perpetual Access Rights, or PAR, means the same thing as post-cancellation access rights, which means the same thing as post-termination rights. CRKN, the Canadian Research Knowledge Network, is the national consortium of primarily academic libraries in Canada that does many things, but for the purpose of this presentation, think of it as our buying club for our big deal license negotiations. So the Perpetual Access Rights Reports project is a project of a committee at CRKN that I serve on, whose goal is to help library staff who believe they have perpetual access rights to a particular year of a particular journal, and they lose that access, to help the library staff with the necessary documentation about license agreements and so forth to be able to successfully negotiate with the publisher to restore that access. And it could be next year, it could be 10 years from when the content was purchased, or when the subscription was canceled, or any time in the future is the ideal. So the scope of this project is the perpetual access rights acquired through CRKN serials agreements, most of which are big deal subscriptions, and they get updated annually, as typically every year you acquire another perpetual access rights year of rights. But that also includes some backfile purchases as well. The approach that we took was to provide the information at a journal title and year level and per institution. So not just a summary of what the CRKN deal itself included, but to be able to be specific for any given member library. They can look up for that journal for that year, do we have, yes or no, do we have access rights to that journal through the CRKN license? The publishers included in the CRKN reports are all of the ones listed on the right, which are basically all of our big deals. So a quick vocabulary lesson first. The term spreadsheet refers to an entire file, most commonly an Excel file. And within a spreadsheet, you've got different worksheets, which are more commonly called the tabs. So what we came up with was one spreadsheet file per vendor, like that list of publishers, like Wiley. And then within one spreadsheet, you've got many worksheets or many tabs. The most important tab is called PA rights. And I'll show you a snippet of it. It's one row per journal title per year. And then there's a few columns that are metadata about the journal and year. And then there's a column that gives the CRKN license agreement code that applies to that year of that journal. And then after that are the columns, one per each participating member, times approximately 70 members, that basically have the yeses and nos. Does that institution have perpetual rights to that year of that journal? And note, we are always talking here about perpetual rights. The committee that did this whole project is also the committee that manages the KBART files that CRKN sends to the holdings knowledge base management companies for what we should have ongoing access to. But this project isn't about just what we have currently licensed access to, but perpetual access rights. So in addition to the PA rights tab, there's a few auxiliary tabs. The first three, glossary, context, and agreement codes, I'm going to go into more detail about. There's also a title history tab. that will help make sense of journal name and ISSN changes. And there's a tab to do with coverage exceptions. That's when a specific institution has yes or no, but not because of the standard CRKN license. There's some other complication involving that particular institution, and those are detailed in the coverage exceptions tab or worksheet. The URL at the bottom gives more complete detail about the entire project at CRKN. And obviously we're making this presentation and the slide deck available so you can see that URL later. So the PA rights tab, here's just a little snippet of one of them. This is from the American Chemical Society one, just the first couple of lines, showing that the title, Accounts of Chemical Research, for the year 2001, and is covered by the ACS, CRKN ACS license for 2001. The next line is for the same journal for 2002, also covered by the 2001 license because it was a multi-year license agreement. And the last two columns are the very beginning of the 70+ columns of all of the institutional members with the corresponding yeses and nos, whether they have the rights to that year of that journal. I also want to note that the title ID column is for the publisher's own proprietary ID. That's not some made-up code by CRKN. Okay, so the glossary tab basically is the same across all of the spreadsheets for all the different vendors, and essentially defines what all of the abbreviations and the tabs and the fields and what everything means. And this being Canada, we have everything in English and in French. So that's what that details_EN is referring to, the English language column of the explanations. The context tab is specific to each vendor, and it gives, it's not yet, the individual title level, but summary information about any specific characteristics of the license agreements between CRKN and that particular vendor. And then the Agreement Codes tab links the PA rights code with more detail about the license. So you saw it in my quick sample summary. There was the column with the abbreviated code that references the CRKN license that applied to that journal for that year. And then this table takes that abbreviation and expands it with more detail, including critically the URL to the actual license agreement on the CRKN website. So you may be already thinking, I'm not in Canada, my library's not in CRKN. Does this project do me any good? Yes, I believe so. We spent over 2 years in the committee carefully working out, consulting with lots of people, looking at other possibilities, to come up with the schema that we came up with that I basically just described to you. And so hopefully we've done a lot of the work for you in how to come up with a way to store and record this information for the long term effectively. And you could certainly use it with your own data. If you get your big deals from a consortium, you might want to bring this to your consortium leaders and encourage them to do something similar. You can also, with no consortium involvement at all, simply make your own local spreadsheets following as much of the schema as you can, and thereby you can then use the software that I'm about to show you. So here's an example of when I just got started, once we had worked out the schema of creating a non-CRKN local spreadsheet for UPEI tracking our non-CRKN licensed journals' perpetual access rights. To use the software I'm going to show you, you only need the one tab called PA rights. You don't need the glossary and the context and those other things. You can, in fact, put any other tabs that you want to track your other licenses or anything else you want anywhere else in the spreadsheet, as long as you have the one tab called PA rights, which is structured according to the CRKN rules with the header and the column names and things like that. You'll notice that I've got a column that says Univ of Prince Edward Island, column K. even though it's just us, but that column header has to match the same abbreviation of your institution for the CRKN ones, and you'll see where we also reference that in the software. And CRKN provides a blank template of an Excel spreadsheet that you can use to make your own local files like this. Okay, so I keep talking about this software thing. The Journal Entitlement Project is a web-based tool for searching these spreadsheets formatted in this way. I'm switching to the word entitlement as opposed to PAR for a moment. And what this is, where it started, is UPEI's undergraduate computer science program has a fourth-year capstone 2-semester full-year project that the students do in groups, and they look around campus for anybody who has a real genuine software development need and that's suitable for the students to do in 1 year. And I've done many of these over the years with that class, and so I did one. So I was in the role of the client, and I wrote up the specifications and the minimum requirements and so forth. And then I worked with the students for the entire year, providing them guidance from the client's perspective in terms of what we needed, and while they wrote the code. So they finished it, and it's fully working. It's open source. It runs on any Apache web server that supports JavaScript and PHP. It might be other web servers too, but Apache's the only one I've had the opportunity to actually test it on. Like I said, it's open source. The code's all in GitHub in my own account now, and it's got a standard Creative Commons license on it, or maybe an MIT license. It's got an open source license on it. It was whichever one the students decided they wanted to apply to it. It's designed to be a public tool because none of the data that's going in this is in any way proprietary or confidential or non-disclosure agreement covered or anything like that. So if your web server itself is visible to the entire internet, then in theory the entire internet could search this thing. There's no authentication on the search. You can search by title or ISSN. You can sort, filter, and download the search results. And it also makes it very easy for the library staff using this to, if they get a yes to something that you're now missing, to be able to access the full original spreadsheet that hopefully has all that information like CRKN does, with the specific license agreement information that they can then follow up on and get ready for that no doubt difficult phone call or email to the vendor to dispute why you lost access to that journal. And here's what the basic search looks like as branded for UPEI. So there's a search box, a search button, a little filter button, and then below that it lists out the actual files that are currently loaded in its database so you can see when they've been last updated. Because typically the big deals, if you have an ongoing subscription to them, you should be acquiring a new year's worth of perpetual access rights for most of them every single year. So you want to make sure those files are up to date. And with an example of putting in a journal name, next to the search button is the filter button, and this is just showing you what that filters. It can filter to a single year or a range of years. And here is another example, searching by ISSN rather than by title, and the particular ISSN is JACS, the Journal of the American Chemical Society. And this is showing you how it pulls the data from the database as JACS year 2018, gives you the agreement code of the license that applies. So it's the 2016 license that applies to 2018 because it was a multi-year license. And the last column has rights yes, tells me that UPEI should have perpetual access rights to 2018 of Journal of the American Chemical Society. I also want to bring your attention to the buttons in the top right corner. TSV, tab separated values, allows you to download your search results into a tab delimited file, which is really easy to open up in any spreadsheet software. The admin button will get you to where you can log into the admin functions, and the help button takes you to the wiki in the GitHub project that basically explains everything. It's not really context sensitive, but there's not a lot of context, so this is pretty much it. So the column headers, you'll notice, have some little icons after each one. Title, package name, etc. The up-down arrows are sort, ascending and descending, and the little filter button, I'll show you what that looks like, is doing a very simple case-insensitive substring search on the data in that column, whatever it is. So this is a bit of an odd example to just show off the fact that it's not a begins with search, it's a substring anywhere in the data search for the filter function. And then whatever you filter to does get picked up in, if you do the TSV download, it'll be just what you filtered to. And here's just another example of a why but example of result. Okay, so the admin functions. Unlike the main interface, of course, the admin is password protected. It is something that is stored locally, it's hashed, and you set it at the time you install the software. And then within the admin, this is where you ingest all of the CRKN spreadsheets, assuming you want those. And what happens is all that data gets taken from the spreadsheets and is put into an SQLite database. Now, I want to take a moment to explain what SQLite is. It is, if you know Microsoft Access, part of the Microsoft Office for Windows suite, you are familiar with the idea that a database doesn't have to be a big central server. So you may, I mention SQL, you may think Microsoft SQL Server, MySQL Server, PostgreSQL Server, Oracle SQL servers, but you're thinking a big server that has to be installed somewhere that then your database gets stored into. But it's certainly possible to have a single file sitting on your local hard drive, which is SQL compatible data in a compact database in a single file, and that's just like a Microsoft Access file is. And SQLite you might think of as an open source, non-proprietary equivalent to a Microsoft Access database. So that's where all the data goes. That's why the system requirements are just for the Apache web server, and you don't also need any kind of database server. So in addition to the CRKN spreadsheets, you also, in the admin, is where you ingest and upload locally maintained spreadsheets that I talked about before that follow the same basic rules, and you configure your local options. So here's what the admin looks like. You refresh, or the very first time ingest, the CRKN data if you want that. On the right, you can upload your locally created spreadsheets. I want to direct your attention to the bottom left for a moment. The download upload error log is once you do an upload of a locally created spreadsheet, you want to immediately check the error log to make sure that there were no formatting problems in that file that would have prevented the data that you thought you just loaded from actually successfully getting into the database. So that's how you can check that as you go along. If something does get horribly corrupted, like your network glitches or the server glitches or something right in the middle of trying to ingest data and your SQLite database ends up corrupted and doesn't work, there's a big red button to just simply wipe the entire SQLite database to empty and then just reload all your data. I mentioned before about the name of your institution needing to be exactly a certain thing at the column header for the PA Rights tab, whether it's your local file or the CRKN files. And here is where you actually set which institution this installation is for, and that string in that field has to exactly match the column header with the yeses and nos for the PA Rights. And then below that, you can choose optionally in this main search interface whether you want no results as well as yes results that match your search query to be included in the output. So that's up to you. It's just a simple toggle. Then for CRKN users, if CRKN at some point down the road needs to redesign their website and they move the path where all of the spreadsheet files are, that button at the top that says refresh CRKN data has built into it to use this path to automatically go find all of the spreadsheets for CRKN and grab them, so you don't have to pick and choose them individually or load them individually. But if CRKN rearranges their website, we didn't want our members to have to go into the source code of the PHP code to fix that. So we just made it part of the admin settings exactly where that path is. And you could just change the URL here, and then you're reconnected back to finding the CRKN spreadsheets. And then the bottom right of the screen full is, I mentioned that the help button leads you to the GitHub wiki. If you decide to fork this process, or you want to provide your own help documentation or whatever, you can change where that button goes to any URL you want. And I'm going to scroll down on the admin page. It lists all of the files that have been loaded, and you can see for the CRKN files, we came up with a file naming convention that makes it extremely clear exactly which package it is and exactly what's the last modified date for this version of the spreadsheet. So when's the latest ACS data that we've put in here is March 29th of 2022. So you can tell if your files are out of date or not. You typically, for the big CRKN load, you don't need to delete the files in order to refresh them. The system will automatically refresh them properly into the database the way you would expect. But for your non-CRKN spreadsheets, you might have reason why you might want to delete it completely and then load a new one. So that's why we make this available. And then below that are the 4 basic customize branding configuration options. Okay, so some last further thoughts. Anytime you get involved in an open source code situation, there's long-term issues of maintaining the code. I know basic JavaScript and PHP, and right now the whole thing's just in my hands, but I'm certainly talking with the people at CRKN about the possibility of some of their staff getting involved in helping. I don't really anticipate there's going to be much that needs to be changed, unless Apache does something huge with their web server software that would break this and need the code to be changed to match. So we'll see down the road as that happens, but it's certainly my intention and CRKN's intention that we go forward with this thing and keep it maintained. And finally, this was all about serials. And the next logical question is, what about our perpetual access rights to ebooks? So the same committee that did all this work to come up with the schema for serials is now, and I'm on it as well, this working subcommittee for this, has now just started work on an ebook schema equivalent. And the first one took us about 2 years from the time we started meeting and talking about coming up with the details of the schema to the time we actually rolled it out as so quote-unquote publishable, is finally official. So hopefully it won't take us longer than 2 years to do the same for the ebook one. The plan then will, depending on how different that one is once we've worked it out from the serial one, then we'll figure out whether it's possible to modify the source code of the search tool to also include the ebook one, or whether we need to make sort of like a parallel separate set of web server code for searching the ebook holdings, perpetual access right holdings, separately from the serials. So as we get further along on that project, we'll make that decision about how to handle that. Okay, any questions?